when Oprah told me her story, and Misty Copeland told me her story, and Danielle Boulud, the chef, told me his story, and Vanessa Williams. I just thought, wow. I was like any journalist when you're onto something. Like, this is really something. I can't wait to share this with the world.
Welcome to Securing the Bag, the Roots exclusive series on work, entrepreneurship, and the secrets to success. I'm here with award-winning journalist Deborah Roberts, who's recently published a new book, Lessons Learned and Cherished. And now she's going to share those lessons with us. Deborah, thank you so much for being here. So in your book, you talk about a professor who made you realize that journalism was a calling. Are there any stories you can share with us that made you think, wow, this is why I became a journalist. This is why this is my calling?
Well, there wasn't any one story with this professor. It was really just a case of me trying to figure out what my passion was, what I wanted to do. And when I left high school, I knew that I liked speaking, public speaking a little bit, which is kind of interesting because I was pretty shy growing up. But I had sort of come into my own. I was a cheerleader and I was involved in different clubs in high school. And we were sort of fooling around with videotape at that time, working on programs in high school. And I knew I wanted to do something on television in some capacity. So when I went off to college at the University of Georgia, I just assumed maybe that was acting. Maybe I want to do, theater or films or whatever. And so when I initially started off in a drama program, I quickly realized that wasn't quite what I was interested in. I had not worked on the newspaper or the school newspaper or the yearbook staff, but I had a feeling news was something that was interesting to me. So I took this introductory communications class, and this professor, Dr. Bethune, was just riveting in the way she presented these different facets of communications. When we talked about, she talked about everything from public relations to, radio to newspapers to television. But when she talked about investigative journalism and she highlighted some of the journalists of the day and just basically how this all came together and how important it was and shining a light on the ills of society, I was just fascinated. And I was always kind of a news junkie, I guess, growing up. I grew up in one of those homes where the evening news was always on at night. In our case, it was Walter Cronkite and the CBS Evening News, and every night I watched it. And I didn't realize how glued I was to those stories and the fact that they really sort of spoke to me. And then when I took this class, I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do. It's probably communications and news, not acting. So then I went on to pursue my journalism career, and that just sort of ignited something in me in terms of my interest.
What do you think makes a good journalist?
I think at the very core of a good journalist is curiosity. I think tenacity, because sometimes you've got to stay at it and stay at it. You start off on a story, and particularly if it's an investigative story, it doesn't always come together right away. And sometimes people say no. You want to interview a subject and they say no, and you stay on it if you feel like you can actually maybe make some ground. So I think it's really being curious about the world, curious about just things that may not even necessarily be in your purview. I still read the newspaper, the actual hard newspaper, and I get comments on planes all the time from flight attendants who say, wow, somebody's still reading an old-fashioned paper, turning the pages. But there are times when I stumble across an article that I didn't even know would interest me, and suddenly I learned something, or there was some light shed on something that I never would have known anything about. And so I think being curious about the world, but also just having sort of a passion to want to tell stories, to want to meet people, to want to find out what makes people tick. When I read a story about teachers, for instance, may as well use that example, teachers fleeing the profession at rates that we haven't seen in years, that their job satisfaction is at a 50-year low. When I read these stories, I want to know why. What's going on? I want to dig a little deeper. And I think that is just my curiosity as a journalist, to want to know more and to want to go out and discover.
You're talking about reading the newspaper, this print paper, but I'm also thinking about local news when you say that, and kind of those papers are really dying. A lot of print papers are dying. You got your start in local news. Can you tell me, do you think that local news is something that can be saved, that should be saved?
Oh, absolutely. I think local news is where we learn at the core, really, of our communities of what's going on. And we've discovered that. Even just the story in politics right now, George Santos, right? And all the questions about his resume and how he deceived people. The local news reporting and the local newspapers were actually kind of onto that story initially. That's where we find out really the core of what's happening in all of our communities. Nobody paid much attention in the very beginning, but eventually the New York Times highlighted this story. But there was a local news a reporter who was already sort of sniffing around that story. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of communities, we don't have the newspapers that we used to have. I mean, we used to have a morning and an afternoon paper in a lot of communities, and they were very competitive, right, for the lead story. I think it's so vital that we really see the importance of local news stations. You know, we still see television news, but local news reporting in newspapers, you're absolutely right. It's dying because people just aren't choosing that. But thankfully, there's digital reporting, much as like what you're doing. And I think it is very important that people recognize that that's where you're going to find out about what's happening at the local school board and you know, the decisions that are being made about education in your community or about any other decision that is being actually thought about in your community. That's where you're going to find out about it. So I think local news is critical to sort of our survival, really, as communities, to our citizenry. I think it's really, really important.
I want to kind of keep digging into this turbulence and this change in the industry. I mean, obviously, we've seen a lot of, you know, hosts that have been very influential, you know, Melissa Harris Perry, Tiffany Cross, Don Lemon, and obviously for all different reasons, but we're seeing this turbulence in the industry. And I'm curious, I mean, do you have any advice for people coming in to kind of how to deal with that, deal with all of this change that's happened?
When you say turbulence, when you say change, what kind of change?
Yeah, so I mean, moving away from local news, it would be one aspect. I would definitely say kind of the death of local news, the death of print papers, but then also these people who have been really influential in the media space no longer, you know, having these positions. I think there's a lot of, you know, places like Vice going under, BuzzFeed News going under. We're seeing kind of an industry in obviously in transition. And I'm curious, do you have any advice for people coming into this?
I think really more than anything else, tenacity is really the key right now in this industry because it is very difficult and it is very stressful and it is frustrating. It is really frustrating, I think, for journalists to see that sometimes the kinds of stories that we want to tell aren't really getting traction. And also the attention span is very, very quick. Yeah. I mean, everybody wants something just like that. And the headlines, you know, you read it digitally and you feel like you know the story. So we want to dig a little deeper. Sometimes there's not the appetite for that. But I think that at least to me, you push and you push and you push. And oftentimes, if you have a good relationship with your editors or in our case with executive producers, you know, you can be heard. But listen, you know, in terms of voices being silenced and people losing their jobs, I mean, that has always happened throughout our industry. But I think that, you know, there's always going to be someplace else. You know, if you're not, if somehow it doesn't work out for you at this particular place, then there's maybe another place and there's digital and there's so many other platforms now. So I think it's really just about being flexible and being, and just having that stick-to-itiveness.
You've been sharing such great advice. And I think part of learning is making mistakes or having these hard moments.
Oh, I made plenty of those along the way, trust me.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that. I mean, what was kind of the hardest moment in your career and how did you overcome that?
I don't know that there was any one hard moment. I had a lot of hard moments, particularly starting out in local news. I remember, I mean, I tell the story, and I don't know if I tell it in the book or not, about how when I was an intern at a little station in Georgia, small town Georgia, and I was out with a reporter helping out, and I'm an intern. And my job, and at that point, we used to carry these very big, heavy cameras with the battery pack and the tape pack. And I was supposed to press the go button when she was recording and the stop button when she wasn't. Well, we got back and realized I got them somehow mixed up. So I pressed the stop button when she thought she was rolling and the go button when she wasn't. So we had a lot of pictures of feet and, you know, rustling and grass in the car, but we didn't get the interviews. I was mortified, and I'm an intern and I'm trying to make an impression. And I remember going home and crying, and I don't remember exactly what my mom said to me, but she gave me kind of a little buck up talk and, you know, go back out there and just give it a shot. You know, everybody makes mistakes and so forth. And I did. And one of the things I learned early on in my career, even the next time when I made my mistake, when I was actually working a full-time job, and I, you know, screwed up something or I just did a terrible live shot, was that I had to just pull myself up, dust myself off, and keep going. Because it's easy, I think, sometimes to just cave and say, this isn't for me. I can't do this. This isn't, you know, I'm not going to be good at this. But you just have to, you know, you sort of fake the confidence. You fake the confidence until you get it, fake it till you make it. And I think I just kept doing that, and I kept pushing. And I think for me, for a lot of my bosses, my news directors over time, they could see the passion that I felt, but they could also see sort of the resilience and the fact that I was really determined. And that spoke volumes about me and my, you know, just what I wanted to be as a reporter. So I think hanging in there. Barbara Walters used to always say, sometimes you just have to outlast your detractors. And I think that's true. You know, the news director who doesn't like you, the executive producer who doesn't really think you're talented, you know, you hang in there as best you can. Sometimes they leave. Sometimes they're either fired or they get another job, and then the next person might like you better. And so you just hang in there, and, you know, things sometimes change for the better for you. And I feel like over the time that I've been in network television, I've seen, you know, executives come and go, and my career has kind of gone up and down, but I have hung in there because I've really believed in it. I've loved what I've been doing. And I think that's been the longevity for me.
Just, it's so helpful to hear people who are so successful talk about the moments that have been difficult, because I think it's so easy to imagine that you've always been up here and
no, lots of failure, but you learn from the failure. And I think if you're willing to do it, if you are willing to learn from the failure, you can kind of turn that around. I mean, I was terrible at live shots when I began doing them. And then that actually over time became kind of my better talent, I think, in this business, but because I really wanted to learn from that and to make myself better.
I'm wondering, is that why you wanted to write this book, for people in those moments?
Actually, I wanted to write the book because I just felt like it was a story that needed to be told. And as a journalist, at the end of the day, I'm very intrigued. I mean, you know, many people write their memoirs and things like that. But I became intrigued by the idea that teachers were leaving the profession. And then the idea that I often talk about my grade school teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Hardy, and I see people light up and they start telling stories about their own teacher. When I was coming in here, the gentleman who led me in here started talking about his grade school teacher. So all you have to do is just mention that, and people are just off to the races with this nostalgic, you know, trip down memory lane. And I thought, wait a second, maybe this is something. Maybe we need to revisit the time when teachers felt valued and respected and really honored. And a lot of them don't feel that way right now, at least according to a lot of the polls. Many, you know, 3/4 of teachers, at least in one poll, said that they would tell people not to go into the profession. I mean, that's a terrible way to look at what they're doing and to think about how they must feel about what they're enduring. So I thought this book could serve as an inspiration, a conversation starter, and just sort of an opportunity to give teachers a hug, give them the, you know, sort of the inspiration that they've given so many other people. And I didn't start off with this big noble idea, but I just think it just became that. And the more I heard these stories, when Oprah told me her story, and Misty Copeland told me her story, and Danielle Boulud, the chef, told me his story, and Vanessa Williams, I just thought, wow. I was like any journalist when you're onto something, like this is really something. I can't wait to share this with the world. So I hope it becomes a conversation starter that might lead us to start rethinking teachers, educators, how we're treating them, how they are being viewed at this moment, and the support, offering them the support that they need.
That's an incredible way to talk about the book and to kind of to have this love letter to teachers. Was there any story with a teacher in this book, or just any of the amazing people in this book, that kind of jumped out to you, that you were surprised by?
You know, there were a lot that surprised me. Lorraine Toussaint, the actress, told a story that was, on the one hand, heartbreaking, because she described a teacher who was really sort of cruel to her. And then she described another teacher who was just inviting and embracing, and how that sort of, like she said, she went from toxic to tonic, and how that defined her life, making that transition from something terrible to something beautiful. And I thought, wow, to be able to look back on a horrible, you know, educational experience and to see the bright side of it was really shocking to me. Will Reeve, who is an ABC News correspondent, but he's the son of Christopher Reeve, the famed actor who was paralyzed in a horse riding accident, lost his father, and then lost his mother shortly thereafter, talked about a teacher who essentially kind of stood in for his parents when he lost his parents. It wasn't about academics, but it was about somebody who gave him a great sort of moral shot in the arm and looked out for him, and he's still friends with him to this day. And I knew Will, and I've known Will for a very long time. I didn't know this particular story. So it sort of grabbed me, you know, by the throat, really, if you will, because I didn't expect to be so emotional about some of the stories. Carrie Shahidi, who's a producer, but the mom of Yara Shahidi, broke into tears telling me about a teacher who just really meant so much to her. So there were so many, I think, over time, that just one after the other after the other. Sergio Hudson, the clothing designer, talked about a design teacher who basically kind of yanked him by the shoulders practically and said, listen, you're getting cocky, you're going to screw this up, you're not working as hard, you're not as passionate as you could be, you're going to ruin what could be a great career. And he said she saved him. And I had a number of people who said, my teacher saved my life. I mean, literally said they saved their lives. And I guess maybe when you're thinking about how things could have gone for you down one path and it could have been really disastrous, but instead you were able to find success and inspiration, I just thought that was pretty remarkable in so many instances.
Was there a moment in your career where you felt like you made it?
Oh, wow. You know, it's funny. I have a funny story, and there was not any one moment, but I remember maybe it was at NBC because I began my network career at NBC. And as a young journalist, I always wanted to work for the networks. And I wanted to either be on a 60 Minutes show or a 2020 program because I loved long form storytelling. So I wanted to work on one of those programs. And when NBC came up with the Dateline program at that time, which was their version of a 2020 60 Minutes, and I was hired for that program, I was very, very excited. But when Barbara Walters phoned me herself and asked me to come over and talk to her about 2020. And I will never forget hearing her on the phone, Deborah, it's Barbara Walters. And I thought, I am being punked. And that was even before people were being punked. I just couldn't believe that that was Barbara actually on the phone. And she, of course, was a mentor and an icon in this industry. So when I did come over and I met with the executives at ABC News in 2020 and joined that program, I think at that moment I thought, okay, I've made it, because this is what I saw for myself on that living room sofa, you know, sitting, watching television, network news way back in the day with our shag carpet, watching television. This was the moment that I really dreamed about, and it was finally happening. So I think at that moment I thought, I've done all right. I've made it.
Wow, that is an incredible story, and I cannot imagine getting that call.
Yeah, nobody would probably get that same call today, but I think that people were she was making an effort to really reach out and extend herself. And I just thought that was really pretty remarkable. And she went on to be a great mentor of mine at ABC as well.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, for sharing all of your incredible lessons and stories. I've really appreciated it.
Thank you for having me.